Hello everyone, welcome to the Orchid Hut. My name is Dana and I'm excited to share with you today an orchid that I found at my local garden center. And the name of it is Dendrobium New Liberty White, and it says 2018. I have not done any research on this orchid yet, but I'm guessing that possibly means this was hybridized in 2018. And as usual with orchids that you find at your local garden center, they've often been neglected for a while. But as I inspected this plant, I noticed that its canes were not particularly shriveled. The leaves look in good shape. It did previously bloom from this cane. I don't know if this was this year or last year, but it did bloom from that cane. And then this year it has an even taller cane with a bloom spike coming out, and there's one flower left on that, so at least I know what it looks like when it blooms. It's a very, very tall dendrobium and difficult to get completely in the camera. But I am going to repot this now. And the reason is because it seems very, very dry. It looks like a lot of sphagnum moss has just been placed on the top. But if I peek through the little holes in the clay pot, I can see the roots, and the medium down here is completely dry. So I imagine this orchid is thirsty. So the very first thing I'm going to do is start taking this sphagnum moss off the top. I'm going to see what's underneath that, and I'm going to give this good little orchid a soak. Let it rehydrate itself, and then I'll pick back up on this video tomorrow when I start repotting it. Okay, I'll be back. Okay, so before I put this orchid in for a soak, I wanted to show you what I found. More than anything, there was just sphagnum moss in this pot. It was probably, I don't know, 3 or 4 inches deep, and it took me a good 7 or 8 minutes to pull all of that off the top of the pot. Inside, the orchid was the tiniest bit attached to the clay pot, but not much. And when I did separate it, you can tell that originally this orchid would have been in a round pot, and all of this sphagnum moss had been stuffed up to about where you see this black mark on the stake. So these canes were buried 2 or 3 inches in the sphagnum moss, which is never a good situation, especially if the moss is wet. And now that the sphagnum moss is off, I can tell that there were 1, 2, 3 other canes that have already lost their leaves. They were completely covered by the sphagnum moss. It drives me crazy, absolutely drives me crazy, when orchids are not treated properly for the sake of aesthetics. And that was the case here. It was in a nice pot. They used the sphagnum moss to cover up the old unattractive canes and to make the plant look more visually appealing. But if left that way for any length of time, the orchid really would have begun to suffer, especially if that sphagnum moss was wet. So I'm going to go ahead now, I think, and put this in a pot to just let it soak overnight. I want to see which of these roots actually green up, if any of them do, and I will pick back up tomorrow. Okay, so the dendrobium soaked overnight, and as expected, and this is true with many dendrobiums anyway, most of the roots did not green up. But this is not all that unusual for dendrobiums. There was a little bit of green maybe at some of the root tips, but I will have to look more carefully to figure out which roots are alive and which ones are not. For example, you can see when a root sort of has like a papery outer coating, and then there's nothing but a thread left, that root is dead. And in fact, I think if you pull with your nail, the papery part will come off and only that thread will be left, and that's a sure sign of a root that is no longer viable. But they're not all that way. It's going to be a matter of kind of picking and choosing which roots to keep once all of this peat is out of here. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to slowly work out all of this peat from the roots. It is going to take quite a while because it's pretty compact. And at the very end, when I have most of it off, I will take it over to the sink and give it a rinse, and then I will be able to inspect the roots more carefully to see which ones are dead that need to be trimmed off and which ones are still alive and viable. So for the sake of everyone's time here, I will probably be speeding up this video starting about now until I'm able to get all of the peat out from around these roots. Okay, so this is after rinse number 1, and I left the cane in there, the stake, because it gave me something to hang on to. This is not completely cleaned up yet, but I'm going to go ahead and unclip the stake. It has a little clip as well as a green twisty. I'll take that off. I'm going to get this stake out of here, and I'm going to be throwing this away. This looks like mold, mildew, something that's not good for orchids, so I will be disposing of that. And now that that stake is out of there, I will take it back to the sink and see if I can finish getting some of this peat out from around the roots. Okay, wow, I was at the sink trying to wash away all of that old peat media, probably for a good 10 minutes. And you know, sometimes you just kind of get to a place where you say good enough is good enough. I always try to be very thorough with this, but these roots were really just impacted with that old media, and it was extremely difficult to wash out. It's not a perfect job, but I think it will be okay. At the very base of the plant, probably from when it was a young seedling, it had been potted in some sphagnum, and so I did make sure to pull all of that out because that staying wet at the base of the plant is not good, especially in my environment. Okay, so the next job here is going to be just to give it an initial sort of tidy job. And I have already flamed my pruning cutters here, and I'm going to take off these old bloom spikes. You never want to cut with a pair of scissors that hasn't been sanitized from the previous job. And that looked like that had bloomed twice from the top of that cane. And unfortunately, I'm going to go ahead and cut this bloom off. It's the very last bloom. I'll insert a better picture of it in the video. But I want the plant to focus on root development and new growth, and my belief is that these old flower spikes that are just hanging on consume too much of the plant's energy to try to have that be maintained. Okay, I will come back, and on this particular bloom spike it was still green, so I'll put a little bit of cinnamon right there on that cut. It will help it dry, and it will also keep bacteria from getting in that way. And down here, our first little cleanup is going to be to inspect these roots. Now, usually the oldest roots are near the old canes, and in this case, this particular cane is but barely attached, so I'm going to go ahead and just take that off. These canes as well. I don't think they are helping support the plant any longer, and could likely just be a place where infection or bacterial type things could happen. And when I get the cinnamon out in just a little bit, I will very carefully try to put just the tiniest bit there and the tiniest bit where I twisted off that old cane. But I'm going to be very careful not to get it on the roots because it is a desiccant and you don't want to dry up any of your roots. So, unfortunately, many of these roots are feeling very soft and papery rather than firm. So I think I'm going to go to the sink and maybe give it one more quick wash. Put the cinnamon on and then figure out which of these roots to cut off. I'll be back. So, this particular root system was pretty extensive and tangled and gnarled, and sometimes with orchids that have root systems like this, it's just impossible to go root by root and find every single one that may be dead and cut that root off. It would just be far too time consuming. So what I did is towards the back of the plant here, where I had twisted off the old canes, I actually trimmed the roots in that section because they were clearly not alive anymore. The rest of the roots here towards the front, you can see these are a little bit green, and most of the other roots towards the front still feel like they have some substance to them, so I'm going to leave those. I tend to give a good root trim because I think that promotes new root growth, but at the same time you don't want to go crazy and cut off all of the roots that are, providing water and nutrients to the plant. So I think this is where I will leave it. I did not put the cinnamon on yet. I had second thoughts about that. I do want to spray these roots first with hydrogen peroxide, and then I'll kind of reevaluate if I want to put the cinnamon on there. Before I spray the roots though, there is one other cleanup job I want to do. I'm going to carefully go down each one of these canes, and I'm going to pull off the dried sheath, as much as I can anyway, because that's the place where moisture can collect, where insects like to go, and once the canes are mature, they really don't need that dried sheath any longer. So I'm going to stop the video, take a little bit of time to pull off as much of that dried sheath as I can, and then I'll be back and we'll spray the roots and see what else we need to do. Okay, I think we're getting ourselves to the end of the cleanup here. Some of the sheaths wanted to pull off. That was fine. I didn't force it where it didn't want to come off. And I did a little bit more trimming of some dead roots down towards the bottom. But the thing that I want to point out that's very encouraging about this orchid is that it has two places where it's putting on new canes already. There's a little tiny start of a cane right here, and there's another sort of a little bump of a new cane right here. So it looks like this orchid wants to go ahead and develop two new canes. Now that's great because those 2 new canes will eventually put down new roots on each side of this plant so that it can continue to be supported. All right, so next up I'm going to clean up a little bit. I think I will just do the cinnamon up here where I trimmed off the bloom spike. Then we will spray the roots with the hydrogen peroxide. Okay, I'll be back. Okay, so this is the cinnamon that I use for my orchids. And my finger was just a little bit wet. And I'm going to touch that bloom spike where I trimmed it off. And then I want to make sure that I rinse my finger because I don't want to get that cinnamon on anything else. Now this orchid did sort of set aside for a while so that these roots could dry a bit before spraying the hydrogen peroxide. You should always use hydrogen peroxide 3%. That's what's safe for orchids. And it helps if you spray it when the roots have dried off a bit. Otherwise, the hydrogen peroxide is a bit too diluted to do its bacterial job. It does not hurt if you get the peroxide on the canes or on the leaves, and you just have to make a judgment call how much of the orchid you actually want to spray. I am spraying it from multiple angles so that I can be sure that all of the roots are covered. You'll hear it fizz a bit as it's doing its job, and that's a good thing. So we're gonna leave this to dry over here for just a little while. If you hold it to your ear, you can actually hear it fizzing. I'll set that aside for just a little bit, and then we'll be back to pot it. Okay, we are back and we are finally ready to pot our Dendrobium orchid. Now, the first thing that we have to do is we need to choose a pot. And you'll notice that these roots have become more white. This orchid did dry overnight, and that's perfectly okay. But we need to choose a pot. So this particular pot has slits in it. It's made for an orchid so that the roots can get a lot of aeration. It has a bit of a cone in the bottom, which is also a good thing for orchids. And so if we put this orchid in this pot, this is a pretty good fit actually. You don't want the pot to be too large. If we go up a size in pots, this is a little bit large, I'm afraid. So I think I'm going to use this smaller pot, and this one will work out well because it actually fits back inside the original decorative pot that the orchid came in, and I think this tall pot is sort of well suited for this tall orchid. Okay, so we're going to use this smaller plastic pot, and I have an assortment of media here. We'll kind of talk through it. The very first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to put some large orchid bark in the very bottom of the pot, and this will provide some extra aeration when the plant is watered, and that's a good thing. So about that much is good. And then I have some charcoal, and that will be going in my mixing cup, just a little bit, a few tablespoons. And then this mixture is some larger orchid bark pieces like this, some sponge rock, some mica, and that's about it. But mixed in with that is about half smaller orchid bark. So I used some larger orchid bark, and I also used some smaller orchid bark, about half and half mixed together. So we're going to put all of that in this mixing cup, hoping not to make a mess. And just by pouring it, it got mixed up pretty well. So we're going to put some in the bottom. And then we're going to test the height of our orchid. Okay. So previously I had pointed out the new growth, and I do not want the bark to cover up where the new growth is going to be coming from. So that's actually looking pretty good. Okay. Okay, now it is okay to have some air spaces between the roots, perfectly okay, but you don't want too much. You can press it down a little bit, but again, not too much. The orchid does need to be stable in the pot. At the end, we'll sort of give it a test, make sure it's not too wobbly. If it's wobbly, we can stake it if we need to. And then if you hold on to the plant and really tap the pot, a lot of the media will fall down into the air spaces. A little bit more here. And then we're gonna check. Okay, so what's happened is, because those new little cane shoots are way down at the bottom, we can still see the one right there. It's not covered up, so that's good. Let's kind of check on the other one. I believe it was on the other side of the plant. Make sure we haven't covered that up. No, we haven't. And so there is the other little tiny cane coming up right there. And we have not covered that one up, so that's good. We're going to press down just a little bit more around the edges to make sure that it's secure in the pot. And it is a little bit wobbly because the orchid is so tall already and so top heavy. Okay, so I think that's going to need to be staked. Okay, so let's add the stake. I think I want to stake this tallest cane. I think that will provide the most stability. I'm going to try to put this straight down in the pot so that it's nice and sturdy. And then from the back of the stake, try to clip it. And this is requiring a rather large clip because the cane is so fat. But that's much better. Now see, it doesn't wobble in the pot nearly as much. Okay, so I'm going to water the orchid. I'm going to double check that the new growths have a way to come up on the side of the plant without being covered. And that is the repotted Dendrobium. We'll go ahead and put it in its decorative pot. And it looks much, much happier than it did before. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to the Orchid Hut for more videos to come.